But I mean, hey, Nigel, but I mean, the title is Field CTO, right? So.
And we are live. Welcome to tonight's meetup. If you already joined, feel free to say hi in the chat. If you do so, make sure to select all attendees before saying hi. Maybe include your location. It's always interesting to see where people are joining from. We'll give this another 1 or 2 minutes to allow people to join. Maybe a few housekeeping rules before we get started and before I hand over to you, Casper. This meeting is being recorded. You'll receive a recording tomorrow in an email together with some useful links. Obviously, the link to the latest Puppet State of DevOps report. But I think we'll hear a bit more about that tonight. Thank you for saying hi, everybody from Canada, Auckland, California, Redwood, Copenhagen. Nice. Welcome, everybody. UK, Sweden. Nice. We do have a quite international crowd here. They're all interested in listening to what you have to report, Nigel. Great. Okay, so if you have questions during the interview that Casper is going to have with Nigel, feel free to either drop them in the chat where you also said hi, or use the Q&A section. Both works, and Casper will make sure to bring these questions up either during his own questions or during the Q&A section. Cool, and with that, I think we're ready to start. As I said, this meeting is being recorded. You will receive the recording tomorrow. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to you, Casper.
Thank you so much. And I'm happy to be back here with Nigel. My voice is a little less crystal compared to last time. But I think we will get the content as crystal as last time, because again, it's Nigel, and Nigel has been doing this for 10 years. And with that, let's maybe start off with that, Nigel. Can you, like, for those that are joining new and that don't know you, give us a little bit of background about yourself and 10 years of DevOps State of DevOps Report with Puppet? Can you give us a brief reflection on the last 10 years to start with?
Absolutely. Thanks, Casper. It's great to be back here. So my background was in operations, so essentially large-scale Linux system administration, but also a bunch of Mac OS X and Linux endpoint management as well. I moved over, I worked as an SRE at Google for about 4 years before I joined. So originally Australian, moved to the US, worked for Google, and then joined Puppet when we were really quite small. We were about 8 or 9 people, and I was originally running product. At about this same period was when the whole DevOps movement was starting to escape beyond, the first couple of DevOps days, the first few things that Andrew and Patrick had done to try and put together and codify this whole movement. And Puppet's very much sort of sat at the center of all of that. So we started doing the State of DevOps Report 10 years ago. And to be honest, in those days, a lot of that was trying to explain to people exactly what DevOps was and what it actually meant. And particularly, I think folks in the enterprise were very resistant to the idea of how DevOps would actually, whether DevOps was actually even a good idea, to be honest. And I think if we fast forward 10 years, we see that everyone's either feels like they've succeeded well enough that they don't really talk about DevOps anymore in applying some of these principles about breaking down silos, or they're really struggling with how to implement them at scale. And this sort of brings us around to one of the reasons why I love chatting with the Humanitech folks so much, is that what we've seen in the enterprise in particular is the way to succeed with scaling out DevOps initiatives is by following something like the platform team model. And I think this has been something we've been seeing emerge over the last couple of years. And it's one of the reasons why this was such a big focus for this year's State of DevOps Report.
That makes sense.
I'm field CTO at Puppet, by the way, normally based in London, but currently navigating the nightmares of travel during a pandemic. And I'm back in the US just for a little while to do some paperwork, honestly.
And so, okay. And I just said that you cannot go to the office. So you're staying in a hotel next to the office, which is super productive. I mean, like, long live remote.
Exactly.
Amazing. Okay, let's dive a little deeper before we go into the results. You have this very specific way of segmenting teams and then actually looking at the results. And I think you call it low, medium, and high evolution of DevOps to calibrate the conversation a little bit. Can you explain why you're doing this? Why are you taking this statistical approach? so we can understand the results a little better?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we ended up in this period about 3 or 4 years ago when we were doing State of DevOps Report, where it felt like the dam had broken in terms of mainstream enterprise, large traditional companies trying to do DevOps. And I kept having the same conversation over and over again with, directors and VPs and C-level folks, where they'd be going, look, we have a sense of where we should end up, that there should be, lower friction, fast flow of software delivery, low cognitive load, better quality, but we don't really know how to get from where we are now to what should we do first? What should we do second? Where do we actually start here? Because if you look at, a 200-year-old bank, it's built up processes and has all sorts of organizational scar tissue. It's built up over years that you can't just sweep away. And any large organization of many tens of thousands of people takes a while to have change actually happen. So we've been segmenting folks for a while in terms of outcomes, like what's your mean time to recovery? How quickly can you deploy software? How quickly can you respond to change? What's your failure rate? Those sorts of things. And people naturally were falling out when we did cluster analysis into several groups where there were sort of the low folks who really hadn't made much progress at all at adopting these principles. There were the medium folks who were doing okay. And then there were the high folks who'd actually really succeeded and the flywheel of momentum was humming along. And when we analyzed the actual results, people fell into 3 pretty distinct categories. And so I think we can see that there's a step change for this sort of implementation where once you get it right, you see a big leveling up in terms of returns. Now, to come back to things a little, one of the things we wanted to work out was, how do you get from low to medium? How do you get from medium to high? What were the most important things to actually adopt? And some of this stuff is really basic bread and butter things. And the fact that all of you who are probably on this webinar, you might not realize this, but you're probably quite advanced in terms of the adoption curve of these sorts of practices, just by the fact that you're here choosing to opt into this sort of a webinar. I work a lot with pretty traditional organizations who there are a lot more people who it's just a 9-to-5 job for. And I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing that at all, because I actually think society could do with a lot more, work is just work and life is life, and life is the important thing and work's just a means to an end. So I don't want to sound snobbish at all about this, but there's some pretty basic things you can do. So for example, one of the things we saw was that some of the most impactful things you can do at the very beginning of your journey is go, let's have a version control system, a single one that everyone can access. Let's have a secret storage so people can put secrets inside it so that we can actually encourage everyone to put all their stuff in version control. And you can get hung up on, what does it mean to do DevOps really, really well? But there's these basic things that most organizations are not really doing. And so to sort of sum all this up in a little bit of a theme, what we'd seen since we'd first introduced the evolutionary model a few years ago was that most people are still stuck in the middle as we talk about it. Like they get from low evolution to mid levels of evolution, but most organizations are struggling moving beyond that. And one way you can think about this is that they've optimized for the team. So an individual operations team or development team might actually be doing quite well, but they haven't optimized for the whole organization or the team of teams. And that's what we tend to think of when we talk about high levels of evolution.
And I just wanted to sort of mirror this. And by the way, you're Australian, and so by default, it's baked in your identity. You can't be snobbish. Don't worry. So, but I think I just want to compliment that, because I don't know whether you know that. I actually wanted to share that with you. We are running DevOps maturity tests, and like by default, and on Twitter, I think in particular, and I think we have over 1,500 people that responded in the last I don't know, month or two, and we we're calculating a score. I mean, that is an awfully unstatistical way of approaching this, but it's really interesting because your theory is manifesting itself in the data there. Like if you just plot all of the DevOps maturity scores between 0 and 100, you see this chasm, if you want, right? And it seems super hard for people to cross that. And I think, yeah, there's a very, very interesting, and I think that's why your report and talking about this, and we've talked about this last time, that you can't always compare yourself to Netflix, right? Is so important.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think one of the things there to point out is, DevOps was an ops-driven movement and was kind of a grassroots-driven movement of practitioners going, this all sucks. Let's actually make this better and work out a better way to do things. And I think what that's meant is that a small team, like the team lead, the people around them who work on that team, can actually achieve quite a lot in terms of improving the way they work and overall efficiencies in terms of software delivery. But if you want a whole organization to do it, you often can't do that as the operations lead or even the director of infrastructure or something like that. You need to actually get your higher level management on board. You need to get people relatively aligned. Like getting large groups of people to do stuff is a complicated problem. Like we're not very good at it as a species. Wear your masks.
Yeah. Good example. Okay, very good. Then let's dive in and let's look at the pillars. I think it was like if you look at the headlines, DevOps is not just automation. DevOps is not the cloud. You have this focus on team topologies and patterns on platform teams. Let's go through all of them. DevOps is not automations. That is maybe counterintuitive. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think one of the unfortunate things we've seen, similarly to Agile in a way, is that when you have these labels around a movement that are actually creating change and, making a difference to how people work, people are going to jump on the bandwagon and we're going to get armies of consultants and vendors, not necessarily behaving super authentically around this. And everyone's talking about DevOps. I sell software, I can make it sound like DevOps software. And I think one of the downsides of this has been that we've ended up focusing on the technical aspects of DevOps, of automating things and measuring them, rather than necessarily the breaking down of silos between orgs. And I'm sure many of you who are on the webinar have come across the idea that in large orgs where someone's called a DevOps engineer and literally their whole job is to manage a Jenkins pipeline or do release engineering. And again, I don't want to sound like I'm ragging on release engineering. I think build and release engineering is like an incredibly critical role inside modern IT, but it's just doing that is not doing DevOps. And so we've seen this myth, I think, build up in two areas. One is that if you're doing automation, if you're using infrastructure as code, if you're taking any of these approaches, then you're doing DevOps. And that's just the technical aspect. And similarly, I think with cloud, we've seen a bunch of organizations essentially rebrand sysadmins or systems operators to be cloud engineers and say, we now do DevOps. What we saw from looking at the analysis was that in terms of automation, it's not really possible to do well at DevOps without having a really high degree of automation. It forms the social contract between different teams. It allows you to do things reliably. There's all sorts of benefits to it. But when we went through and did the statistical analysis, it's not actually predictive of DevOps success. So automation is necessary in terms of succeeding at DevOps, but doing better and better and better at automation doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do better and better at DevOps. With cloud, we saw a slightly different relationship, which was that organizations that are good at DevOps, like they're good at communicating between teams, they're good at optimizing the overall pipeline across different parts of the software delivery lifecycle, those organizations are better at using cloud. They manage to make more use of the elastic, consumption-based, all of the advantages that cloud can give you. People who are good at DevOps tend to do better at cloud, but those things are not synonymous. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was like one element that I keep like coming back to is this, where we say you build it, you run it, right? Everyone should own everything, and that is like great by definition. Like it solves the throw over the fence problem. It gives you ownership. It has all these positive net effects. But if you come up where you basically do a misinterpretation of the DevOps idea, and you now throw everything at them, and then everything is a you build it, you run it, and we say there is no operations person anymore. Everyone needs to do Jenkins pipelines in a very extreme model. We're also not helping this. And then look, what I wanted to say is that DevOps is not just automation. Is so insanely important because you are making clear that it's like it's so much more on the cultural level, on alignment between these teams, of making sure that you understand how much cognitive load, like where's the trade-off between how much self-service can I do, how much automation do I have to provide, how much cognitive load do I actually give the developers, and if you don't constantly communicate about this, and very important, you do like the qualitative communications rather than the transactional, you get nowhere, right? And I think that's why this finding is so highly relevant.
Yeah, and there's one thing I wanted to jump onto there, which is we talk a lot about optimizing cognitive load for developers, and it's absolutely critical that, you know, we try and make it so that people who can focus on their job and do it efficiently. But I think one of the things we see is that if you have entirely autonomous DevOps teams, and I've seen this a bunch of times in big banks in particular, where folks have gone, we're going to create small 2-pizza teams, they're going to get to own what's the infrastructure they build on, how do they deploy, how do they manage everything, and everyone kind of goes off and does their own thing. That may do a good job at locally optimizing for that particular value stream team or that application, but it doesn't optimize for the whole organization. And what you're actually doing is you're creating cognitive load for your auditors, for your IT asset management folks, for all of your governance issues around cost control and security.
For and all so the people I think that have to go in later and like clean up the mess and
exactly
left and
how do you switch from one team to another? Like all of these things become really, really complicated. And so I think what we've seen is that the organizations that are succeeding are the ones that are adopting the platform team model. And the analogy I keep coming back to try to think about this is, think about roads. You know, like we have a bunch of different kinds of vehicles that drive on roads, but we want the roads to all have the same kinds of rules. Imagine if you went from one suburb to another and suddenly stop signs were a different color or a different shape, or you drove on a different side of the road. There are efficiencies we get out of creating common standard rationalized layers underneath everything. And I think the platform team approach of going, let's have a single place where all of the concerns around infrastructure and everything below it are actually solved for the developers. And we're solving that in a self-service product mindset kind of way. And so this is one of the reasons, to return to something you mentioned earlier, of why we invited the team topologies guys to be co-authors of this year's report, which is that the team topologies model, if you haven't come across it, really just describes this world of, you have platform teams, you have value stream teams, and then another 2 kind of specialists. And so this year, what we did was, we're all big fans at the State of DevOps Report of the team topologies model, is we wanted to go, let's actually validate it. Like, this makes sense to us. We all believe it. Let's go out and validate it. And it turned out the data was really, really strong that, yes, the platform team model is a better way to deliver software.
And do you already have data on how widely distributed this approach is now? Like how it's starting to grow, or?
I think it's still aspirational for an awful lot of folks, that everyone's starting to talk about platform teams in the way they were talking about, you know, SRE and GitOps and various kind of other flavors of the month. But I think if you look at the fact we've got Gartner and Forrester out there, the big analyst firms talking to senior executives going, what you need is a platform team strategy. And actually, I think producing really, really good work around this stuff. We're seeing this happening more and more, that people are realizing this is the way to actually scale out. And so I guess my quick note to those of you who've tuned in is that I actually think if you're specializing in being a platform engineer, in being a product manager for a platform team, if you are succeeding at using a platform well inside an organization, this is a very good step for your career right now.
Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit on the team topology stuff. I mean, we're both friends with Matthew and Manuel, and we both really like their work. Can you explain in a little more detail, and especially as this is aspirational for most, how do we help people tip their toes into this world? What's a good way of starting with this? And I think, is that what can help us cross the being stuck in the middle situation?
Absolutely. This is the way to succeed at it. So there's a few things I think you want to get in place before you get really excited and start following a platform team model, which is one of the core ideas around the team topologies model that we investigated this year was, does my team have a clear purpose? And do you have a clear understanding of its responsibilities to other teams? And again, this sounds really basic work, but one of the biggest inhibitors to success I see inside large organizations is this, like, I don't know what that team does. I'm not sure what this team is meant to deliver for that team. Where are the responsibilities? Where do we say yes? Where do we say no? And it turned out when we asked folks, we saw that more than highly evolved teams, more than twice as often as low evolution teams said, my team has a clear understanding of our responsibilities to other teams. My team has clear roles, plans, and goals for their work. And teams next to me have a clear understanding of their responsibilities to my team. And this sounds really basic stuff, but I think you can't actually achieve a significant and substantial transformation until you've actually got these things in place. And particularly, I think when it comes to a platform team and value stream teams, you want clear responsibilities of what are the developer teams actually allowed to do? What are we making easy for them to do? What can they choose to use on the platform versus opt out of? Those sorts of decisions, I think, are almost impossible to make unless you get that idea, the first groundwork going of what is my team's responsibility and what are different teams' interactions with each other. So we saw this over and over again through the report. We asked a whole bunch of questions around what kinds of teams. The particular thing I'd say too is when you look into the report, you'll see that there's a whole section on what types of teams are there, and we have a whole bunch of plain language descriptions of those things. The higher evolution organizations have a smaller number of team types, and they tend to follow the team topologies model. The folks at the lowest levels of evolution tend to have every single different kind of team with unclear responsibilities between them.
Okay, so hey, there's a new cloud operations team. Hey, there's a new SRE team. I can
yeah,
completely agree.
Absolutely.
So we have one question from Siddharth about how do you prevent a platform team from becoming yet another silo that needs to be broken down? How do you?
This is a fantastic question. So I'd say one of the things that's really key. So let me first start with platform is one of the most overused and abused words inside tech, and we're pretty good at doing this to words in tech. But I think when we're talking about the platform team approach, there's a few things that are really key. One is that primarily the value you're delivering to your users internally or externally is via self-service. So you spend a lot of time collaborating with your users at the design phase of what you're providing via self-service, but then collaboration is expensive. It's not actually the best way to actually, do efficient at scale interactions between teams. We know delivering things as a service via an API is actually a more efficient way. So what we say when we're talking about a platform team approach is that you need to have a product mindset. You need to be thinking about your users like a market, like what are their actual problems? How can I build something compelling that will actually solve their problems for them? It's not about just providing raw access to infrastructure. So if you're doing this well, you're building product in the way we know how to build product these days, which is you get early feedback from your users, you make sure you have feedback loops between the people who are producing the products and the people who are consuming them. And if you do all of those things, and particularly try and get a community of practice going amongst your users, and that feedback comes back to the platform team, then you won't be siloed. But I'd say this is an approach I've seen happen more than once, which is where the platform team becomes itself another silo because they're not taking that product mindset into account of going, what do our users actually want and what problems are we actually solving for them?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's exactly, we're back to this pattern. If you don't have good communication, right, and if you don't nail the cultural elements, you have the best automation in the world. And I myself have seen so many examples where you have a really restricted like platform team that implements, I don't know, OpenShift, but you can't deviate from anything, and then it works great in 95% of the cases, but the 5% are just a pain in the ass, and you have to work through this, and you have to ping central ops, and it takes 3 months, and you go nuts, and then what happens is so interesting. Everyone starts to build workarounds and come up with like this way or this way to circumnavigate the whole thing, and it completely collapses. And another really interesting thing that I've seen and that the two of us have also talked about is how you position this, right? If you're, and I like to compare it like, are you giving golden paths or are you giving golden cages, right? And so exactly. A golden cage is like abstracted, like take it or leave it. If it doesn't work, I don't know, don't write your service in Python. And the golden path is, hey, this is what it is. Like, we've developed it together. Yes, you can deviate. This is what's happening under the hood. It's not like a black box. It will, I don't know, the output is YAML, and this is how it works. And we've developed this together. We've done this hackathon. And what we're seeing in the data, and I find that so interesting, is that in 97% of, like, if you have a team that has a golden path approach, in 97% of cases, teams are just following the golden path. Maybe it's not perfect, right? But they're following it, that because they know, hey, they're not abstracting me away. It's not a golden cage. I could change that if I want, but I get this set of guarantees to really know that I was. I had this great conversation with Jason over at GitHub. That's the exact approach that they're bringing, and they're measuring the way that they're successful by measuring the thank yous that they get from the developers. And all of a sudden, you have this really conversational model, and it works very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, your answer there segued a little into the question I see Daniela has in the chat as well, which is around advice for product managers. And I think one, to touch upon what you were talking about, is you want to make the golden path, like go, here is a bit of functionality. We want to make this thing easy for people. But I think particularly when you come from, I think, a larger organization IT mentality, we can easily fall into the trap of going, we've built the thing, you have to use that or else. And I think one of the things, if you're doing platform as a product well, is sort of letting go of things a little and going, my users are highly technical. We're giving them access via APIs and platforms and things they can write code on. They're going to write code. They're going to use it in ways that we didn't actually expect. And the whole goal of having a community of practice and feedback loops is sometimes those ideas will be really, really good, and you should pull them into the platform team and go, the golden path usage has dropped to 60% because someone built this other thing that's living in their repository that everyone's using. Let's pull that into the platform. So I think that's one of my top 2 bits of advice for platform product managers is let go a little and allow your users to come up with their own solution. Keep an eye on them, because that's in many ways the top of the funnel for your ideas for new features. The second would be, and this doesn't come naturally to a lot of folks I see in the platform product manager role, is your job is evangelism. Like, your job is not just defining what's going to be built, making sure it's built well and going, yep, okay, I'm done now. But you probably don't have a marketing resource like a real product team has. So you kind of have to take on that role internally, because what we have seen over and over again is mandating these platforms and going, hey, everyone, you must do things this way, just gets their backs up and they just don't actually use it as effectively. But if you go around evangelizing, going, hey, we've listened to you all. We know this is a problem you have, and we're actually going to go and solve it now. Here, look, we've solved it. What feedback do you have? You get a very, very different reaction. But that evangelism role is not something I think that comes naturally to a lot of folks in ops. But I think it's absolutely critical. And if you're in that role of a platform product manager and that's not your sort of natural way of being, like, go look for someone who can operate as your essentially internal developer advocate, who can go out and evangelize and talk to your users and get them using your stuff.
Exactly. So the platform team is almost like a little SaaS company, right? And it has all the different function. It will like listen to user feedback. It does the marketing function. It's almost selling to the teams in a way, but it's
exactly.
And it's like modern sales is not, hey, I'm selling to you like this top down, but I'm actually bottom up listening. How do we do this? Do we want to like add SNCC to the whole thing, or like any of these things, right? And I think that is very, very good advice.
There's a really good line one of the contributors to this year's report, Stephen Thayer, used that I've been using so much since I first heard it, which is, to succeed at this sort of work requires top-down support of bottoms-up enablement. And I think this is a really good way to think about it, that you need your grassroots and your folks on the ground doing the work. They're the ones who best know the problems that should be solved. But if any of you are listening to the webinar who are in a more senior management role, your role is to support those things and give them scale across different parts of the organization.
Yeah, that is a very, very, very good example. Okay, so let's go through more of these elements. I think one of the things that I'm just like personally interested in, you said like DevOps isn't the cloud. There's still a lot going on. I like recently read some IBM study that there is so much left on-prem, like we're going hybrid, multi-cloud, all of these different elements, and it does feel like on-prem is probably here to stay, right? They'll always, always, first of all, but for a while there'll be still a good amount of on-prem things. Does the report say anything in that direction, like how to bridge these different worlds? I know you in particular are also working in larger setups, old banks in Geneva. That's at least where I imagine every large old bank is. Is there any insights on that?
Yeah, so there's a few things I'd pull apart there. One would be, I'd say, cloud is inevitable, and we're seeing everywhere, even the most, behind the curve customers that I work with, most of their new greenfield deployments are happening in the public cloud. But the thing that we saw from the report was that if you're not very good at managing on-premise, you're not going to be very good at managing the cloud either, because essentially it's the same work at a faster feedback cycle with more pressure and more change, and more work needs to be programmatically done rather than manually done. Like if you thought clicking through the VMware interface was an inefficient way to manage things at scale, try hitting the Amazon AWS interface. Like it's a complete nightmare. You need to program all of these things. So we are seeing, however, that there is a small shift of folks going, this particular workload that I've moved to the cloud, it's actually just not cost effective to do here. Like maybe it's heavy with data, maybe we're doing lots of inter-region transfers. Let's either move it to the edge or bring that bit on premise. And I think the people who are good at automation, are good at DevOps, and are good at cloud also are good at moving workloads around between different environments, because they're either using a platform team approach where there's an abstraction in place, it's highly automated, all of these sorts of things. One of the things I thought was really interesting of this year's report that's related to was that at every level of DevOps evolution, the problem of your legacy environments was a massive one for folks. So even the folks who are doing really, really well really hadn't nailed, how do I solve my legacy environment? And when we dove into this, I thought this was pretty interesting, which was that when people say legacy, they don't actually mean the oldest stuff they have, because that often tends to be mainframe work. It's often quite rigorous. It's quite reliable. It may be, a user experience nightmare, but it's works pretty well. When people say legacy, they tend to mean all of those applications and infrastructure that were built in the 2000s, 2010s, a certain era of heavyweight enterprise Java application with 1 billion different vendor dependencies. And solving that is like a space that I think we could do a lot better at as an industry. And I think there's an interesting, I think once we see people do really well at the platform team approach, we'll see the next phase for them is going to be, well, how do I take some of the advantages of my platform and actually apply them to my legacy environment, where we don't, we may not even have an application owner for this thing anymore, but maybe there's some stuff we can put around it to make it a little bit easier to manage operationally.
Cool. Very interesting. So we're already slowly approaching the end. I just want to make sure that everyone gets the chance to ask questions. Please do ask questions. We've received lots of questions before. But please, again, and I've tried to cover some of them in our conversation. If there are any right now, feel free to shoot them at us. There is one question from Siddharth, and he's asking, again, we're sort of jumping a little bit, going back to the platform team. They're starting to build their platform, and they're asking what's a certain critical size below which this approach doesn't work. Is that an approach that you're seeing tied to a certain headcount or a certain number of application or anything like that?
I do think there is a scale below which it doesn't necessarily make sense to run a fully fledged platform team. But I think there's a few things to note here, which is that your platform can have a small or a large set of capabilities as you define. So let's say you're in a really small organization. What are the things that are related to the dependencies to deliver an application, whether it be infrastructure or governance or business readiness process or change management or whatever your particular organization has? Are there things where you feel like you could gain efficiencies by giving everyone self-service access to that? And so an example I think here would be, even if you're in, imagine a relatively traditional organization 10, 15 years ago, that's like 10, 15 developers. Even at that scale, you often find devs starting to get irritated of going, well, provisioning a new machine is a real pain. I need to file a request to someone, or I'm using, Vagrant on my laptop, and I need to get it over to our virtualization infrastructure. So folks tend to automate those things and provide them via self-service, package signing with access to a certificate, opening up a firewall rule, doing a load balancer. And that's a platform. If you're providing this functionality in a common way across all of your teams, that's a platform. But I would be wary of, at a small scale, the overhead of running a platform team. You may not actually get the benefits. Like if you've got 2 dev teams of 8 people each, there's probably not a lot of gross inefficiencies across those teams. Now, giving developers a simpler experience and going, here's all these things you don't have to worry about, that may be of value to you, even with 2 small teams of 8. But I think it depends upon your developers, upon the kinds of applications you build, and on the rest of the organization. So to, I guess, sum up, I do think there's a scale below which an all-encompassing platform doesn't make sense. But even at relatively small scales, there's almost always something that you should be providing as a common layer across things. An example might be producing a package when you're building and releasing software. You probably don't want all your devs building packages differently to give to your end users if you're producing software.
Yeah. Another good question from Sandesh. We talked about platform teams becoming silos. How do we handle them becoming a bottleneck? We also have the issue that the platform team wanted to get got it right the first time due to limited size of team, and the application teams got stuck with suboptimal platform implementations. I think we're back to the golden path situation here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a problem, and in some ways it's a good problem. It means things succeeding at a certain degree if you're finding that your platform team can't keep up with requirements. Now, I'd say my general approach here would be try and actually get a minimum viable product out. And this is another over-abused term in our industry, but if you're having to produce a suboptimal platform implementation that you don't think hits the barrier for, or the bar for a minimum viable product, then you need to change something about the process and how you're doing it. So do fewer things, produce more milestones, work in a leaner way. But I think ultimately the application teams need to do the job they need to be able to do. And I think this comes back to, as you're saying, Casper, the golden path versus mandating a golden cage, which is if the platform team can't deliver a certain capability, there's got to be a way for the application team to do what they want. You sort of can't have it both ways as a platform team. You can't go, I want everyone to use this stuff, but if we haven't built it yet, you're out of luck. Like you've got to work out how to have that sort of balancing act. And I think, again, this is why it's really critical to make sure that your users aren't shut out of whatever lower level access is required for them to come up with ideas and solutions on their own.
Yeah, brilliant example. We have one question that I find it's a long question, so let me try to summarize this. I think it comes down to what is worse. Is it worse to abstract too much, or is it worse to throw too much stuff on everyone and give them too much? You build it your own door. It's a very big question. But how would you if you would have to make a decision, how would you make the call?
Yeah, and I mean, this is, I think, the eternal problem in computer science. We need abstractions. We need, we're not all sitting there writing assembly code. We're not writing, we have libraries in operating systems for a reason. We're not building all of our applications by opening up raw sockets and, communicating back and forth with it. So you need abstractions in order to expand the all that can get utility out of things. But you do raise a point that I think is really important, where one of the missteps I've seen platform teams make is going, we're going to build a platform on top of Amazon or Azure, and we're going to remove all access to the lower level APIs. Now, this is where the conversation I think gets a little complicated, in that the public cloud platforms are themselves platforms, and they're successful in many ways because they offer a platform-like experience to their users. If you go and write your own APIs that sit on top of all of those already existing APIs, it means you're hiring someone who's experienced in developing on Azure and has used Azure infrastructure a lot. suddenly that knowledge is not useful to them at all because you've replaced it with an entirely different interface. If you're building abstractions entirely to exert control over your users rather than actually solve problems for them, you're not really taking the right approach there. So this is sort of an it depends answer. What I would tend to say is that if you focus on not repeating work that's already available to your users, so if they need to request a new infrastructure as a service virtual machine in the cloud, like just give them the API for whatever platform you're actually using, because your developers have probably used that before. What you should focus on as a platform team, what are those higher order solutions that aren't provided by the platforms you're consuming when you build your platform? And it might be something like, give me a whole test environment for a standard 3-tier web app that we develop internally, or something like that, where you want to give developers a higher order bit of functionality where they can go, I need to do a regression test. Give me a whole test environment. That's the sort of functionality I would focus on building, rather than trying to replicate work that a much larger team of engineers working for one of the big cloud providers is already working on.
Yeah, and I think the opposite direction is I've seen that as well. You have these let's say like very eager SREs or ops people joining, and they say, now everyone needs to know everything about Terraform and everything about Helm charts and everything about this and everything about that, and then all of a sudden like dropping people and say, hey, you operate this all on your own now. And it has almost the same negative aspect. It's really hard to define what's worse, where people are completely overwhelmed with that and stuck in the middle. And have you had experience with that as well?
Sorry, could you say that again? Sorry, I missed that.
No
worries. Glitched out.
Yeah, so the situation where you have a very eager team in and say, hey, let's try infrastructure as code. Infrastructure as code is everything now. Everything operates. Everyone operates everything. We want you to know, like this is your new setup. We operate Helm charts for this, Terraform for this, Nick for this, and we have to get that live in two weeks. And you throw everyone at it, and like it ends up them reaching out to a central function again, whoever that is, to say, hey, I have problems with that, can you help me debug? Like you've not won anything. Have you, is that something that resembles in the conversations you have as well?
Absolutely. And I think this is where, there's a lot of things packed up in the product mindset, but this is where I think really key, in that you need to actually have empathy for your users and be building something that's usable. And David's asked a question in chat of, are you aware of any platform PMs, communities of practice? I haven't seen lots of them. I've seen more of the platform engineering side than the PM side. But I think one of the key areas that I've been really keen on seeing more evidence for is people caring about user experience on their platforms. Yeah. So it's not, so again, we're talking about, modeling this like a SaaS internally. Like you need a person doing marketing, you need a person doing the product work and evangelizing. But also if you're operating at any kind of a scale, like actually focusing on the user experience of people consuming your platform. So you're not just throwing a bag full of Helm charts that are poorly documented and templates for them to clone to do things. I think these are not products we would give to end users. And so we shouldn't do that to our internal users either. I mean, unless you're a company where every developer already knows Helm charts inside and out and you have that sort of culture, that may be a perfectly satisfactory interface, Yeah. I worked with the team recently that's still using XML and XSLT for absolutely everything because they were a heavy Java shop and they were just like, we actually have all of this tooling built up. And so we're running all of our infrastructure as code using this. It's fine. And it's more reliable than JSON.
Exactly. Yeah. That is so true. Like that you have to do something that doesn't increase the cognitive load of the user. It's really, really as simple.
Absolutely.
I think, David, we're working through this. We want to get more communities. We're working on these platform meetups. We're having a lot of conversations. We have a lot of guests. Like just last week, we had someone from, I think, Stefan from the Achievers explaining how a platform on their GitOps setup. We had Avanza here. Like we're trying to get out the stuff as much as possible. There's internaldeveloperplatform.org with a lot of stuff. And I think we said that before. I think we really have to do that. We have to build PlatformCon and do like a couple of days maybe of lots of talks and content and like bringing people together. I think that would be very, very valuable, because like the conversations everywhere, but there's not really a common ground here. We're reaching the end of this. Thank you so much for so many questions. One last thing that I want to ask you, Nigel, like one year ahead, or let's be like very forward looking, 4 years, 5 years ahead. What are we seeing? What will accelerate? Where do you what's your gut feeling for the trend?
Yeah, I think if we're looking 4 or 5 years out, and hopefully this is not bad news to everyone, but I think barely any of us will run our own infrastructure anymore. So this hopefully is not radical news to all of you, but I think, what does it mean for those of us who, who build platforms, who have work in the operations field? And I think one of the things that's going to be really key here is vendor management. And Charity Majors did a bunch for us in this year's report talking about where she sees the future operations. And I've been thinking about this a lot with platform teams, that if you're looking that much further out, the platforms we build are going to be built based upon other platforms. And your ability as either a platform engineer to work with those platforms, or a product manager to work out how you're going to architect and glue those things together. This is, again, I think, an interesting thing where it's just as we were talking about how the product manager for an internal platform team needs human skills and to be able to go out and get people excited and evangelize and have sort of work on social interactions. The same is going to be true for the way we interact with our vendors. We're going to be tying together a bunch of different vendors. We're going to have to interact with those people. And I think this is one of the most exciting changes in system administration since I first joined, is that we now actually have to interact with other people and care about them, which I think was something we weren't necessarily that good at as an industry. So I think that's going to be the big shift. The platforms we build will be made up of other people's platforms.
So it's getting out of the basements, getting out there, getting things lined up. All right. Exactly. Like yourself, getting out of the States again. I hope that goes very well for you.
Thank you.
I hope you have a wonderful time. I hope you don't get in touch with Delta anywhere. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending the time with us. You've joined from all over the world. So have a great day. Have a great evening. Nigel, I hope we talk very, very soon, latest on PlatformCon in 22. And we'll stay in touch and send the recording afterwards. Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight.
Thanks.